Welcome back to Global Environment. Let's continue our discussion of biodiversity and this time particularly the threats to biodiversity in the current extinction crisis. This slide you can see the big factors involved in the growing human population and its consumption patterns. And the number one threat here, as you can see, these are the number of species affected in terms of threatened and endangered species in the United States, is habitat loss and fragmentation. We'll just move our way through these factors to just give you a sense here. But this is the big one. This is the biggest issue of all, which is basically conversion of habitats, be they aquatic habitats or terrestrial habitats, for our purposes. This is a good look at the whole fragmentation process, habitat fragmentation process as it's called. You can see here both a loss of habitat, original habitat, which is in this case deciduous forest for all the creatures, plants and animals that live there, and the dividing up the remaining habitat into smaller and smaller bits as housing development moves in. But also you can see a process of it's getting more and more difficult for plants and animals to move around this landscape, to migrate, to disperse, to just a simple move. That it's a loss of habitat and a loss of connectivity that really defines this biggest issue and biggest threat. And finding a way to keep plants and animals healthy and their populations sustainable in this increasing human domination of the environment is the biggest challenge, really. This is an interesting aerial view of New York State, northern New York State. This is Vermont, New Hampshire, a bit of Maine, Massachusetts here. Just to give you a sense of this fragmentation loss process expressed at a really a huge scale. This is really visible from space. This is the boundaries of the largest protected area in the contiguous United States. This is the Adirondack Park. The yellow are basically agricultural areas. The red are urban areas, and the green is forest cover, which is the original sort of natural habitat of the region. And you can just see where where this line is, the pattern here of habitat loss and fragmentation, loss of places for things to live and loss of opportunity to move around versus what sort of originally was and what we're very successful at maintaining through a protected area here. And you can sort of see this pattern, this process, even from space. It's really quite impressive. So this is the biggest issue of all. Introduced species are a close second. We are moving species around at incredible rates as we move goods in terms of this new global economy. We do this intentionally, we do this unintentionally. This is the case of the Burmese python in the Florida Everglades, a species that I don't think anybody wants. These are basically escaped pets that have not only survived, they're reproducing in the Everglades, and they're not necessarily going to be restricted to the Everglades. They have a potential to spread all over the southeastern United States. These are big predators. And these are just an example of the kind of species that we're moving around that, in this case, for example, are eating many of the very threatened water birds that the Everglades National Park was established in the very first place to protect. And how you get these snakes out of this system is anybody's guess. And this is a good example. Here's another really vexing issue. Cats, of course, are very charming creatures. They are, believe it or not, there's probably almost as many feral cats, abandoned cats, wild cats in the United States as there are captive pet cats, well cared for, much loved cats living in association with us. Cats, they are charming, but they are what they are. They are predators, and they kill billions. It's estimated to be billions of small animals and birds every year. They are a serious force in the environment. How we deal with this, the cat-loving community, and the fact that they are major and pernicious predators on many native species is a really difficult issue. But it's because we have basically created this component of the cat population that is invasive and is feral, and causes lots of problems. Just a couple more examples here. In the city of Worcester, Massachusetts, as we speak, is the forests are being torn down basically because the Asian longhorn beetle that came in on crating from China has gotten in. This is a species that loves our native hardwoods. It has no predators here, limiting agents in the east that potentially can spread to all of our forests and devastate them. So we get into these very difficult situations where when these things are detected, we have to tear down every tree for for whole neighborhoods. And it's very painful, but it's the reality of keeping the larger environment of being destroyed. This is kudzu in the southeastern United States, as you're probably familiar with, smothering the environment. This was a crop plant brought in to help poor farmers, mainly as goat forage, but is now spread everywhere. It's a structural parasite covering every plant and taking light away from it. And this, of course, is the Nile perch brought into some of the rift lakes of East Africa, where it's completely eaten all of the native fishes that the whole population human population was dependent on for food. And this species now has been just used for exporting to Europe, but basically killed all of the native fishes, and also taken away a huge resource for the local people. These are some of the consequences, both for us and for nature, of moving species around carelessly, and that's the essence of the introduced species threat. Overharvest has two different dimensions. One of them has to do with the global economy. Again, very, very rich people paying any amount of money for a piece of a tiger. Tiger bristle, tiger bone, tiger teeth, tiger on and on and on. Every part of the tiger is ground up and used in some fashion. People want to include tiger parts in their own lives for complicated psychological and cultural reasons, but nevertheless, every tiger walking out there is worth probably $20,000 to $30,000 because of the prices somebody will pay for them. And this is a huge threat to tigers. We can protect habitat, prey for them, but the poaching issue is an enormous one. It's driven by this demand for tiger parts. Sharks are another example of this overharvest of sharks for, this is for a lot of cartilage for treating arthritis in people in the developing world. They're talking about rich people with a lot of money to spend, but there's also another aspect of the overconsumption threat, which is just for very poor people for protein. And these are primates actually on sale in a market in West Africa. They're part of the bushmeat trade, and this is a very big issue for mammals and birds that are consumable, and poor people trying to live from day to day are also a huge threat to many species because of just trying to secure protein. I just want to move here now to say we've covered a lot of ground here in terms of what is biodiversity, where is it, what's this crisis all about, what are the major threats, but I think it's important also to ask who cares. And it's a question I regularly get. Why spend your life and your career on this? Who does care about all this? And I think there are some very important reasons to care, and they come in two different classes. One is that we have cared for a very, very long time. For example, what were the very first pieces of art that we depicted as a human species, at least as far as we can know? They were the cave paintings that are still recorded and occasionally found to this day, and invariably they are pictures, very detailed, careful pictures of animals, indicating a great, very powerful relationship. Symbols and other things, but always, always animals. We have an enormous fascination with nature. Just this image alone gives us sort of generally speaking, most everyone gets a positive response from seeing this sort of image. We don't really know why, but it's a universal reaction. And people say it is indeed. We cannot separate ourselves from nature because we are a product of it. There's a whole school of thought, basically having to do with biophilia, which holds that we are basically evolving as a human species. These are basically how we evolved. What you're seeing here in this image for 100, 200,000 years, we basically, if we didn't know nature inside and out, where to find medicines when we were sick, where to find food, the whole schedules of when species were migrating, what plants were good to eat at what times of year. If we didn't know this, we would die. Knowledge of natural history, nature, biodiversity was key to our survival. And so we cannot, having just very recently become an agricultural and urban sort of species, just in 1% of our entire history, we can't just leave this milieu of nature. And that is the essence of those who say that we are intimately tied to nature. Our psychology, our intelligence, and it's at our peril to separate ourselves from it. This take it for what it's worth is one of the bits of information that's, or examples used to bolster this claim. For example, why is it that in our most sacred sites, pretty much around the world, for example, our cemeteries and our parklands, the Mall of Washington, D.C., why is it that we basically replicate a savanna-like habitat in those areas? There's not really any good reason to do that in terms of logistics or economics, but yet our sacred sites, we recreate the savanna sort of situation in which we presumably evolved. This is just one of many, many examples that I could give you about how closely we still are tied to nature, despite, in some ways, our excellent efforts to distance ourselves from it and to erode its diversity, but nevertheless, there's some very, very strong connections here. Those are intrinsic sorts of reasons, but there are other extrinsic, utilitarian, consumptive reasons to really care about the status of biodiversity. This is sort of a joke slide. There's plenty of room for all God's creatures right next to the mashed potatoes, but it does make the point that we get a lot from biodiversity that benefits us day to day. This is a good example, a trivial one maybe, but you may well have a garment with a piece of Velcro on it. That was directly inspired by someone pulling a cockleburr out of their woolen socks in Switzerland. They looked hard at it and they thought, this is the genesis of a whole new fastening system that now we make through plastics. NASA was the key in pioneering the plastics, but it's the same concept of the wool sock and the cockleburr here. We could give example after example, but for example, this is one that just this year and last year are coming online. These incredible new paints and surface finishing substances based on nanotechnology that were inspired by the lotus leaf. You've probably seen how water beads up or forms jewels on the leaves of lotus and other water plants. That is because these plants have very, very fine structure that cause water basically to bond to itself before it bonds to the plant surface. And in so doing, it beads up and it also collects the dirt and it runs off. And when it runs off, it keeps the plant leaf dry. It doesn't collect fungus or anything else. It's a self-cleaner. And the point is, we've now, with nanotechnology, inspired directly by the lotus leaf, we've recreated this in terms of paints. And now this year in the United States, for example, you can get nanotechnology paints developed basically on the concept of the lotus leaf that will really change how we maintain our houses and the costs associated with that. Gecko toes are another example these are gecko toes. They basically are so finely divided. They're little hairs basically on the tips that are so finely divided that they stick to surfaces based on shared molecular forces, shared electrons between what they're stuck to and not. That's very different from all the wet adhesive systems we use in tapes and glues and other things. You can say, what's the big deal here? But, for example, this is a whole new way of binding two objects together, and this will even work in a wet environment. For example, the first applications of gecko tape are now in surgery for binding wounds. These tapes work under very wet conditions, which is a lot better than stitches or staples and other sorts of things. These are sort of specialized examples to get your attention, but the reality of it is biodiversity does affect our lives profoundly. For example, we derive most of our benefits from things like this: food, fuel, fiber, wood, industrial products, and medicines. Most of the world's population is still dependent on the forest as their apothecary or source of medicine. So these are the previous examples were interesting, but the reality of it is we as a species still depend very heavily for these basic goods from nature. The big picture of this is that though there are those who have worked very hard to estimate how important biodiversity is for our economic activity, and this is the figure they come up with. About 10% of global economic activity is dependent entirely on goods and services derived from wild species. You can say 10% of 100%, that's not a lot. On the other hand, if we were to lose this, this kind of a 10% contraction in the global economy is on par with nothing we've really ever seen, and we can't really comprehend. Even the current economic crisis is nothing like this. This is a big deal. We get about $33 trillion per year in direct and indirect benefits from ecological services. This is clean water. The many, many ways that we benefit from biodiversity and the services we are not paying for. So